Okay, I'm loosely in charge of tonight's proceedings, because Gary asked me to. He didn't like the idea of standing up and making a speech. So he said, and if you heard it, you'd probably agree. and he said, how about if we make it a kind of conversation where I kind of run the show. So, sit. And I tried to study how this is done. I nearly watched Parkinson. But I couldn't be bothered waiting up that late. So the first question is, which 12 records would you take if you went? Because that's only 10 in the morning. I can cope with that. Sit down. What we want to do tonight is to find out something about Gary and the book and Stewartie. And I'm glad we've got so many folk here tonight, including, where's Billy Suter? Bill, you must have been the first man to pick Stewart in an official team, because you were captain of the school team when he started to play. So there you are, that's a little bit of history.
Well, this is what I'm worried about. I think half our stories have just gone out of the window, because there's people in the audience who told them to me. There's no use me telling them back to everybody else. Because the actual sources of the research are sitting in the audience.
My part, I played a very important part in Stewart Imlach's development, because I owned a ball. My Uncle Willie in California sent me a ball, and when I go up to Grant Park and I see a dozen footballs being picked at each end, so there weren't that many in Murray when we played. So we played in the square, we played in the streets. My brother John was an apprentice. He was the apprentice ahead of Stewart at Josie Bakey's. And I phoned John to say that this was coming off, and I said, what about a story? He said, well, basically, I was the man who prevented him from being sacked, because Stewart was the young apprentice, and what he had to learn was that if there was nothing to do, you had to hide out of the road, or the wifey would complain to Josie about the fact that she was paying for these people doing nothing. Now, Stewart would never do nothing. Whatever he did was never nothing. He had a tennis ball in his pocket, and he dribbled his way along to the job, and if there was a lull in the job, then he was out there with a tennis ball. Same tennis ball that we played on the golf course on Sundays, as long as Willie Brucey didn't come along and chase us. Anyway, it's Gary that you want to hear. So Gary, how about starting by telling us how you got around to writing the book?
Well, it's a bit of a sad story, the reason I wrote it, because I think, like a lot of people, when they lose a parent, it's only then you think, well, why didn't I ask them this, and why didn't I ask them that, why didn't I sit down with them, and it was only after he'd gone that I just realised how little I knew about his career and his life. Because growing up, it was funny growing up, because he was a footballer, and he was in the public eye. I suppose me and my brothers persuaded ourselves that we knew his career, because we knew the highlights. We knew he played in the 58 World Cup for Scotland, and we knew he'd been man of the match in the 59 World Cup final for FA Cup final for Nottingham Forest. So we knew the highlights, and they sort of stood in for the rest of his career, and we thought, we know Dad's career. When in fact we didn't really know a fraction of it. So it was only after he died, and it was too late to have all those conversations, that I thought, well, I better go around and have the conversations with everybody else and try and piece him together after the fact. So there was that personal motivation that, whether there had been a book in it or not, I'd have done sort of something similar out of, almost out of penance, really. But when I started, I sort of realised as important as it was to me individually to do it, because he was my dad, because in those days all footballers were in the same boat, because they were all playing under the old retaining transfer system when there was the maximum wage. So his story could be anybody's story from that era. So if I told my dad's story, I could tell the story of that whole era of the game, which, it's as distant as life during wartime now. I mean, kids growing up today would have no clue what life was like for a footballer then. So there was sort of the twin motivations, my dad's story for me, and hopefully interesting enough for everybody else to read, but that sort of social history of the game as well through him.
Had you appreciated how they were treated at the time?
No, I mean, like most people, I sort of had the catchphrase in my head, maximum wage, and I knew they were paid a certain amount and there was a ceiling, but I had no idea to just what extent they were, treated like serfs. I mean, you talk about Josie Bakey. When my dad signed his joinery apprenticeship, and even when he signed his professional football contract, by the way, his mother made sure that he finished his apprenticeship at a joiner's down in Bury. She wasn't going to let him give up a proper trade for the dodgy life of a professional footballer. When he signed up for Josie Bakey, that was 5 years, and when he served his time, that was it. When he signed for his first professional club, he was signing away his professional life, because when you signed for a professional club, then they held your registration, and that was it. They had you. They could sack you. They could release you. They could sell you to somebody else, whether you wanted to go or not. They could put you on the transfer list and not be obliged to pay you. You could get to the end of the season and they could say, "Sorry, lad, we've had a bad year. We're going to have to knock a couple of quid off your wages." And there was nothing you could do because they had your registration and you couldn't play anywhere else in the professional game. So, of course, they were lucky to be playing professional football and not be in the factories. But the fact is, not only were they not really earning any more than, the figures are always hard to pin down because there are averages and maximums and everything, but they were really not much better off than the men who were standing on the terraces watching them. And although those poor blokes were working hard jobs in the factories, at least they had the freedom to leave one for another. At least they could put two fingers up to the boss and say, "Right, I'm off." Professional footballers couldn't do that. They were completely beholden to their clubs, which is why I grew up in, whatever it was, 6 or 7 different homes, and my poor mother had to, reconstruct life in a new town, in a new clubhouse every couple of seasons because he was off. He was sold on from one farmer to another like a prize bull,
Yeah. So she wasn't footballers' wives, aren't they?
No, footballers. But no, my mum could tell a whole different footballer's wife's story.
Okay, what's your memories of coming back to Lossie with your father on holiday?
It was, there was no choice. There wasn't, we didn't get the brochures out and say, well, is it Torremolinos this year or Lossie? It wasn't a family debate, but it was great. We loved it, and it was always the first to see the sea. The journey was a bit fraught because my dad, he had no respect for anybody else's bladder. He put his foot down. He had his. May will remember what a stickler my grandfather was, for timings and all sorts of things. My dad was just the same, and once he set off, that was it. He was concerned with making time and what time do we get, what time do we cross the border and what time. And we're all desperate for a wee or a stop for a drink. So the journey up could be fraught, especially when we lived in London. It was a great long drive up, before the motorways opened as well. But once we were here, it was just paradise.
What's your memories of Johnny? There must be quite a few folk here knew Johnny. Johnny Imlach.
Yeah, it was. It's funny. I almost envy all my cousins because they grew up in this community. We had a different life, and we had a great life where we were. But we saw him seldom, and he was quite an austere figure to us as the English grandchildren. He was a lovely man, but he was a very correct man.
He was probably quite austere to the locals.
Yes.
And seriously, I think parents were like that. I remember saying to somebody that Oprah Winfrey had somebody on saying they wanted more quality time with their parents. We didn't want adults. God, adults told you to stop whatever it was you were enjoying.
Yeah. But my great memory of my grandfather was when, and this I suppose is a testament to his strength of character and his sheer force of will. When he was ill, and I think he knew he was dying, the word filtered down, and the three of us, me and my two brothers, we'd all left school and gone off and done things, and one way or another we hadn't been back to Lossie, for a while. We'd gone off and done other things. We hadn't had the family holiday, but we all came up, to see my grandfather, and we took him out, and we took him round as many of his old stomping grounds, and we took him to, to Port Soy, and we took him to all the different harbours, and people recognised him and came out and shook his hands, and it was great, to see the respect that he was still held in, and 3 weeks later we were back for the funeral, and it was almost as though he'd said, right, I've seen everybody now. I've seen the Scottish grandchildren. The last order of business was the English grandchildren. All my affairs are in order now. I can go happily.
Did your father speak about his childhood?
Not really. He didn't. My dad wasn't a great, raconteur or storyteller. I mean, you talk about, parents being austere figures. He wasn't an austere figure, but he was quite a stoic figure. He didn't rattle on about the good old days, and he didn't talk about his glories as a footballer. People could know him for a while and not know he'd been a footballer. He wasn't that kind of man. So I wish I'd heard more stories about his childhood. We heard odd ones about him burning down the odd forest and getting away with it. Despite leaving evidence at the scene, but
playing football was our life really when we were young. We played in the square, get chased off. The bobbies would come every so often. Was it Teenie Ann would send for the bobbies and get rid of us? And then we played at the school. We played across on the golf course. Every Sunday we used to play on what's now the third hole of the relief, and we had to be very careful because the manny who came to chase you was Willie Bruce, and that was Sandy Reid's grandfather, and Sandy was playing. so we had to make sure there was a lookout kept, and I've no doubt that Brucey knew that we were playing and made sure he was seen from a distance, so he didn't creep up on us with time to run. But Billy Souter, he was one of the despoilers of the golf course.
Well, you mentioned Sandy, and he's a great bloke. He's pity not here tonight, but it was a powerful moment for me when I went round to see him, because as you'll know if you've read the book, I sat there and thought, because everybody I met said, the best. Your dad was a good player, don't get me wrong, but the best player was Rexy Reid, And when I went round to see him, and I thought, this is my dad in a parallel life. This is my dad in the life where he said no to his trial with Bury, in the same way that Rexy, in a way I think he's regretted ever since, said no to a trial with Everton when he was in the army. And it's one of those moments that can, you like that, and your life can go one of two ways. And I sat there and thought, this is, this is it. This is my father's life. If he hadn't said yes to the trial with Bury, or if he hadn't been so sick when he'd gone on his first trip on the snowdrop with his granddad Dover, perhaps he'd have done the traditional thing, and football would have become a side issue. And it really brings home to you how those small decisions, when you're too young to make sense of them, you're too young to have any idea how big they might be and how much they might affect your life.
One of the decisions your father took very early in life, and I think we all kind of half recognised it, was to take football seriously. You quote me in the book as saying, we played, he practiced. I don't remember saying it, but
I've got you on side, don't worry. It can all be backed up.
But that's true, isn't it? That many of us, we just played, and your father was always perfecting. He was always doing it better. He trained himself to kick with his left foot. He was right-footed, and he trained himself and played for Scotland with outside left. He always meant to play at centre forward. Is that right? Stuart was always going to play centre forward.
Which is perhaps a bit over-ambitious if you're 5'6". that might be an ambition too far. But no, that's one of the, that's one of the things I really admired about him more, when I did the research, because, I had it easy when I grew up. My dad was the coach at Everton, so I was, I led a life of privilege. I had access to football, and we could go to the game, and there was football, not as much football as there is on television now, but there was football on television, there was football everywhere. And it only really sort of hit me when I came up here, and I thought, well, all right, you were all football mad, but how on earth did you follow football? Aberdeen's the nearest professional club, it's 70 miles away, there's no games on the television. There might be the odd bit of newsreel. You've
see-
all got to pile into Dominic's to listen to internationals on the radio. So, I mean, you had to, it's all very well saying you're football mad, but you really had to work at it, you know, you know, everyone said, oh, your dad's favourite player was George Hamilton of Aberdeen. I thought, well, but how did he decide that? He never got to see George Hamilton play. You know, he's having to read match reports and see the odd picture, and you know, he's really having to work hard at constructing a game to follow in the first place.
I would guess that he must have been 16 or 17 before he saw a league match. We saw Stanley Matthews, funnily enough, play at Borough Bricks.
Yeah.
And Frank Sue and
Well, that was another revelation, those wartime games, because you know, you would never get those people together. They're like fantasy teams, you know, and that they should all be suddenly turning out for, you know, Aberdeenshire Services or the RAF or the Army or, you know, Scotland versus England.
You must smile now at the idea of us swallowing all the journalists right.
I think I'll take the fifth on that.
So, did he ever speak about, you know, his feelings of being taken down to Bury for trial?
No, you know, I really did go around the country kicking myself, thinking, God, you know, because
not to have feelings.
yes, but you know, because no matter how much research you do, and no matter how much good stuff I might get out of sources like you or Johnny Archibald or Colin Tucker or all the people I spoke to up here, when I spoke to other players, even if they were his, you know, his close teammates, they used to say, oh, yeah, you know, great player, your dad, fast, he couldn't understand a bloody word he said, like Scottish, you know, I'm a great bloke. But then when you press them for details, you know, it was their own knee injuries they remembered and their own rows with the boss, you know, they didn't remember the nitty-gritty of my dad's career.
In the case of Jimmy Hill, they didn't remember selling.
Didn't remember him at all.
Or even buying.
Yeah. So, you know, to be honest, the reason I sat down to write the book at the time I did wasn't because I thought, right, I've done my research now. I just thought, there's no book here. I'd done all this research, I'd come up here, I'd sat in the British Newspaper Library at Colindale in North London and read through his career, and I'd been to Nottingham, and I'd been in various places, and I talked to people on the phone, and I just thought, this is all just background noise, this is just all sort of, you know, there's not enough for a book. I thought, I better start writing it, and then I'll see what the gaps are, and I'll come back and fill them in. And you just sort of slowly plough on, and it starts to take shape. But
you're starting now, knowing now what you didn't know then. Would you still write it? Would you write it?
Well, of course I'd still write it, but I mean, it was a much more, you know, it was a much more emotional task than I thought it was going to be. You know, it took a fair bit out of me in the end. You know, but I'm.
What did Mum think?
Well, I mean, she got the first draft. I mean, if she'd objected to anything, it would have come straight out. Because there are things in, I don't know, I'm sure all of you haven't read the book, but I came across a couple of lovely stories. When I was doing my research, up at Colindale on the Northern Line in North London, there's the British Newspaper Library, and you can go in and you fill out your little form and you go and sit at your allotted place, and they bring out these massive great tomes, or they're on microfilm, but dirty great things and big bindings. And so I was reading through his first couple of seasons of Bury, which is where my mum's from, where he met her. And beside the match report in the Bury Times one week was this little box saying, Bury winger apologises. What's this? And it said, you know, Stewartie Imlach would like to apologise during the warm-up last week before the game with Aldershot, whoever it was. He kicked the ball into the crowd and hit a young woman in the face. And I mentioned this to my mum as a little anecdote on the Sunday phone call home. She went, oh. I said, what? She said, well, I remember going once and getting hit in the face with the ball. I thought, well, that's it. You know, ball meets girl. That's how they met. Before he unconsciously picked her out, you know, with a left foot shot in the ball. He thought, I'll have that one. And
you heard it here first.
But of course, then she started backing away. She said, "Oh well, no, maybe it wasn't. maybe it was a reserve team game. I'm not sure I went to any first team games before I met your dad. She was almost afraid of it being true, you know. But I thought, it doesn't matter if it's, you know, it doesn't matter if we can't prove it to be true, as long as we can't prove it not to be true. You know, I'll mention it in the book, and then it's just there. But it's funny you mentioned that, and as I was finding these little stories, I began to feel a bit uncomfortable because I'd suddenly become the custodian of my dad's career. And, you know, my version of his life is no more relevant than my brother's version, you know, either my brother's or my mum's, much less relevant than my mum's. And suddenly, you know, I was the official historian. I was calling her up at the weekend and telling her things, you know, about this man she'd lived with for, you know, all these decades. And it, you know, I thought, it made me feel a little bit strange because, all right, I was the one writing the book, but, you know, my version of him is no more relevant than anybody else's version. So, you know, I sort of fought shy of becoming, you know, the official source of all information on Stewart Imlach in the family.
And where were you born? In Berwick? No.
No, Nottingham. Yeah, I tried and failed to trace my conception back to the night of the FA Cup final. I thought, because it's only about a month out, but I couldn't quite make the maths work. I thought, wouldn't that, you know, to be conceived in a room of the Savoy after the, you know, in a joyous post-cup final celebration. But I'm about a month out. I couldn't, you know.
So, did your mum speak about the time in Bury? Because it must have been still quite hard then.
Yeah, I mean, she worked in the mill.
So the third division then?
They were second division then.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was the, you know.
We would call it first division now.
Well, yeah, it is, yeah. So everything's trying to work out what, you know, future archaeologists will struggle to identify what used to be the old first division. Yeah, she worked in the local mill, and you know, she had a fairly austere childhood, and jobs that growing up I could never imagine existed. She used to tell me about the knocker-upper, the man who used to come round and tap on your window, which is, you know, once you've grown up in the world of alarm clocks, you know, I think it's a funny little niche job that you can never imagine existing. But it was funny the way that she was preyed on by the Bury management when they decided to cash in. My father had been there a couple of seasons. He was their star young asset, and he was marrying the local girl. And he actually had to come home for the funeral of his granddad Derby. And while he was away, Bury decided to cash in and sell him to Derby County. And they obviously thought the big stumbling block would be the local girl who's about to marry this fella. She might not want to go. You know, we don't want anything getting in the way of this deal. So my mother, she was working at a felt works then. She was on piecework. So if you were called away from your machine, it was, you know, it meant there was a death in the family. It was something serious because if you were losing money, pile of work, you know, piling up on your machine that wasn't getting done. So she was hauled out to the manager's office and he said, "There's a couple of men here to see you." And it was the manager and the chairman of Bury FC, and they took her and they went and sat in the manager's car, and they just told her a pack of lies about Derby. So it's a wonderful. There's no slums in Derby, you know. It's a wonderful place, and the air's clean, and you'll have a great life. And you'll get £100 for signing on. Well, the official signing on bonus at the time, unless you were getting any money under the counter, was £10. And there was the Bury manager and chairman talking to this, you know, young, impressionable mill girl while her fiance wasn't there, making sure, you know, that she was sold on the idea, and she'd have £100 to start a married life. You know, think what you could do with £100. And she went back inside cock-a-hoop and said to the girls on the machine, "You know, there's no slums in Derby, you know." He said, "Don't be daft, there's slums everywhere." You're talking a lot of road, but you know, it just showed you how they operated.
Yeah. And they then moved. Yeah,
they then moved, and you know, nowadays when a footballer moves, you know, he'd be put up in 5-star accommodation, and there'd be agencies sent out to identify possible properties for him to look at, and the whole thing would take forever. my mum used to be given the sort of equivalent of a multiple choice questionnaire. She'd be driven round 4 club houses in an afternoon in a town she'd never been to in her life, where she didn't know where the local schools were for us or anything, and be told at the end of an afternoon, pick one of them. You know, because clubs, in the same way that the big mill owners would have, you know, whole little sets of alms cottages or tied housing, you know, the clubs did the same. Footballers would be coming in at short notice, and they didn't have time. I mean, what for a kick-off, they couldn't afford to buy houses, so they'd be looking for rented accommodation. So the clubs would keep a little portfolio of properties and rent them out to players, and it was another handy little bit of leverage come negotiating time, because if you didn't sign your contract, they could have you out of the clubhouse in 2 weeks. You know, there'd be an eviction notice on your doorstep saying, you know, we're having you out in 2 weeks.
When did they buy a house then?
Oh, now you've got me. The first house that I bought was, I'll have to do the number, Bury, Derby County, Nottingham Forest. They bought the first house, yeah, not when they first went to Nottingham, but once he was established and they were in the first division and doing quite well. I think it was the club house that they were put in, and they bought it from the club. So they might have got, I mean, that was one of the perks. You might, you know, when you came to buy it off the club, you might get a better than market rate. So it wasn't all one way.
But it's interesting that somewhere in the book you say that the wives, in fact, were never named in anything that was happening.
No, they were all, you know, and in those days, I suppose it was the formality, but it was Mrs. S. Imlach. You know, they didn't have names of their own. Even at the cup final, there's a group picture of all the wives, and they're all just named via their husbands. You know, Mrs. Stewart Imlach and you know, Mrs. Jack Burkitt. Because no, they just weren't important enough. Even though they were the ones having to do, you know, all the work while their husbands fulfilled their duties to the club. And it's interesting, as I was going round, I wasn't prepared for how much the book became about memory and the fallibility of memory, because a lot of the players, and I don't know what research there is on Alzheimer's. I don't know whether it's more prevalent in men than women, or, you know, it's starting to make me think about the heavy leather balls that they used to head, because I know that's been implicated in a few cases of Alzheimer's. But, you know, quite a few times, I'd go round, you know, to a player's house, and he'd be sitting there with his wife up on the chair with a cup of tea, and they'd be on the sofa, and I'd start asking them things, and the man who'd been through all the experience couldn't remember any of it. He'd lost access to it, and his wife would start telling these stories, and you'd see him go, how do you know this? And she hadn't had the experience, but she just heard the story so many times at dinners and do's and dances and Christmas that she became the keeper of the memory. You know, she'd learned it off by heart like a nursery rhyme. So the fellow who'd been through it couldn't remember it. And the woman who hadn't experienced it firsthand, you know, had all this store of memories, and it happened time and time again. It was quite, you know, a touching thing to see these, you know, because, I mean, you know, I thought to reach a certain age, you want to rest on your laurels and look back and say, that's what I achieved. And there were some blokes I talked to who couldn't remember what they'd achieved, you know, which seemed terribly, terribly cruel to me.
It was a strange time, really, that you played in. You know, masses of people going to watch games. You know. I used to go and watch Aberdeen when I was a student, and there were never less than 20,000 to watch most of the games. George Hamilton played, the gentleman George, he never fouled, never fouled ever. But, you know, there were 20,000, I don't know, half crowns going in. The players were paid 10, 15, 20 quid. Where was the money going?
Exactly. It's a good question. It certainly wasn't going to the players. But it's interesting, and I don't know whether it was an extension of the wartime spirit, or they were just happy that they were actually playing football and not having to work properly for a living, but none of them really seemed bitter about the maximum wage. They seemed more bitter about the retain and transfer that meant that they, you know, weren't in charge of their own livelihoods. But, you know, I spoke to more men who felt guilty for earning the same as Stan Matthews than they did bitter at the fact that they were all only earning 16 or 18 or whatever pounds it was, you know, a week. And the funny, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because no one would wish those bad old days back. You know, no matter how daft the salaries have got now, you have to say it's a good thing that the maximum wage was lifted. But it seems to me that was the last time when you were all paying your £half, that the people who played the game and the people who watched it were the same people. You know, they were the same people and they led the same lives in the same communities. And although it was a good thing that the maximum wage was lifted and they started getting paid what they were worth, that was the point at which they diverged, you know, until it's got to the point today where...
But
I think
don't watch football.
If there's a live match on, I'll usually watch it like this, reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. And, you know, if the pitch in the commentator's voice goes up, I might glance up to see, you know, if anything's happening. But I think part of the reason, there's lots of reasons, but part of it is that bond between the player and the fan, you know, no longer exists. You know, when people say to me now, I support Arsenal, I say, well, yeah, but what do you actually support? Well, I support the club. Except the club's just a business. Hey? You can't support a PLC. You know, they're not a PLC, but you know, and you talk well, I support the players. Yeah, but it's a different cast of millionaires every year. Which players in particular? You know, and you know, and when you boil the argument down, you've almost got them saying, well, I support the shirt. You know, and, you know, and you might as well support the shirt because you know.
They're so off one anyway.
Well, and it's not quite the same, is it? You know, it's harder to if it's a rotating cast of characters who just coming over because there's money here where there used to be money in Italy. You know, it's impossible to have the same emotional connection.
But it's do you mix with young people? Do you find young people are interested in football in the way that we were?
Hard to say. I mean, most of the feedback I've got about the book has been from, you know, sort of 30 upwards. Well, but I mean, I hope it gets a younger readership as it goes on, because it would be a shame, you know. I mean, I'm going to this Stotfield Memorial fundraising dinner tomorrow, and you know, if people don't actively work at, you know, preserving a memory of the past and connection to the past, and you know, putting up monuments and working at remembering it, it will just get all washed away as the generations go. And like I say, that was part of the reason for writing it, because, you know, my dad's generation, you know, they've still got a way to go. But, you know, my dad's gone, and I found several of his teammates were gone. So I thought, if you don't do it, you know, it's like books about the First World War. You know, I mean, a certain kind of book about the First World War can no longer be written because there aren't the people around to tell the first-hand stories. And, you know, no matter how good a historian is, going back into the dry, you know, research material is never going to be the same as speaking to the people who were there and hearing about it, you know, from their mouths.
Yeah, I was speaking to somebody recently, and they were astonished when I said virtually none of the houses in Lossie had inside toilets in our day, you know, and they couldn't imagine that you ever had this kind of situation. And I think it arose because someone came up with toilets in schools. I said, we just never went. It was too dangerous. A, you'd freeze to death, and B, you'd probably finish up in it.
You didn't want to lose the body heat anyway.
Did he speak about his school days?
Not so much. I think he glossed over his school days. So yeah, I don't think there could have been much to speak about. I think he was just waiting to get out and play football.
None of his classmates here. No?
Yeah.
No.
But I mean,
I was half a year ahead of him.
Right. Yeah. No, but you talk about those funny little stories, you know, outside toilets or something that make somebody from another generation go, what? Well, I mean, there are a couple of them in the book. Alan Hardacre, who was the secretary of the Football League at the time, lived not far from Preston, and there was something wrong with his kitchen. I don't know if it was the U-bend or the sink or something, and he called a plumber, and Tom Finney turned up because he was he ran the local plumbing business, and I thought, oh, well, let's try updating that image for today. Can you imagine Alan Barwick, the chief executive of the FA, calling an electrician, and 40 minutes later, you know, David Beckham's there with his toolbox. I mean, it's just an impossible image to update, you know. And the other one was, and this was a great story told to me by Nottingham Forest Scottish goalkeeper Charlie Thompson, Chick Thompson, great fella, who had the best of any of the of the people my father
Never
played
played
with.
football.
Well, exactly. He was stood back there in the 6-yard box when nothing was happening, just surveying everything and taking. I think that's, there might be something in that. The goalkeeper is this sort of super spectator. He's just constantly alert because he might be called into action, but the rest of the time he's just watching the game. Anyway, he talked about in the week before the '59 Cup final. They were down in London and they were getting acclimatised, and the manager Billy Walker thought it would be a good idea, since most of them hadn't played at Wembley, so they weren't overawed. He took them to Wembley, I think the Thursday before the game, and they played a bit of French cricket on the pitch, and they did practice walking up the steps to the Royal Box, And then somebody said, "Hang on, what are we going to do with our teeth?" Because half the team had false teeth, and of course they didn't play with them in, because you get tackled, you head the ball, you can come out through your cheek. So they used to leave them in the dressing room. I thought, we can't go meet the Queen with no teeth in. So suddenly this became a big social ordeal. So they said to Chick, "We'll put them in your cap." Put it in the back of the goal. She said, "No.
Choose your teeth."
Yeah, exactly. And he said, "No, what if Luton score? There'll be teeth all over the, there'll be teeth all over the pitch at Wembley. We can't have that." So eventually, the trainer, Tommy Graham, he had a big red handkerchief like the thing Dick Whittington would, go away with. And everybody's teeth went in. And just, I've looked back at the tape of the game, and you can just see it at the top of the picture. He's half out of frame. But, at that moment of greatest triumph when, in your imagination you think these mighty conquering heroes, and they're all rooting about in Tommy Graham's hanky saying, "Trust to these men." And except my dad never bothered. He must have just been too carried away. So he went up without his teeth.
He didn't have to kiss her anyway.
I mean that, that and the Tom Finney incident, that really brought it home to me. That's an anecdote that just has no possible equivalent today. Just no possible way to update that story. So, sounds like it might be time for questions from the floor.
Well, you're allowed to speak. You're allowed to tell us about him, what he's like in the house. Is he any bother in the house?
John, you told me something. And before John starts, I should say the Lossie chapter in its original form had a lot more about Lossie Juniors, and it had a lot more of the cracking stuff that Johnny Archibald told me. And unfortunately, a lot of it had to be cut because it was between the youth club and Lossie Juniors and Lossie United. The editor at Random House read it and he said, "This is great stuff, but I just can't, it's so confusing. I can't tell the difference between, the juniors and United, and there are all these games. And so, some of my favourite material, I reluctantly had to go back and sort of, simplify it just in order to move the story along. So, anyway, so there you go."
Stephen will find it.
Yeah.
Lossie United were drawn against Killarney late side down in Glasgow, and we decided we'd ask each player for so much money to pay the bus to go down and live in this hotel. The Celtic hotel, it was a Western hotel, but the Celtic team used it. So when we arrived down on Friday night, about 11 o'clock, the manager was waiting and he says, "I'm sorry, gentlemen. We had the Sunday Mail, the Sunday Post, cameraman here, but there's a murder just along the road, so you can't get the photographs there." So the next we went and played Killarney. We got beat 3-1, but didn't matter. So we left Glasgow and went to Stirling, and it was snowing. So we booked a mule in Stirling, and we're off in a mule. Peter Mather, Duncan Dean, myself, running upstairs, downstairs, trying to get them all got into the bus. So the bus set off. I was sitting in the back seat with Jack Clark, who was a goalkeeper at the time. And I said, "Do you hear something milking in the back of this bus, Jack?" I said, "Yes." And we said, stop the bus, here's Stewartie running on the bus, Peter Mather said, "Where the hell have you been?" He said, "I was in the toilet, Peter." He said, "It's a good job you're a forward, you've been a defender of me."
was faster. It was embarrassing for us as kids because he was still faster than us when we thought we were pretty fast at school, but when we were teenagers and he was well into his 40s, he could still beat us. Even smoking, and this is another thing that you can't imagine now. You know, I used to smoke 40 a day, and it wasn't unusual. You know, there was, you know, everybody had their little rituals before a game. One of the Forest players used to go for a fag in the loo before the game, or you know, at half time. You know, Forest when they got promotion from the second division to the first, they gave all the players an ashtray. When he was at Crystal Palace, they gave them a lighter. You think it's just unthinkable now. You know?
I don't remember him smoking here.
That's what England did to him, maybe.
Corrupting power.
And I don't remember Peter Mather ever cracking a joke. he took life very seriously. I used to play for the juniors when I came back from university, but I was never signed, and I played under the pseudonym of D. Stewart. I was Davidson Stewart. When Daisy couldn't play. But in those days, you had protests if you weren't properly signed, and replays, and you know, big fines, 10 shillings.
You talk about coming back to play. It was one of the funny things that I discovered when I was doing the research in the newspaper library. That when my dad took part in the World Cup trials for Scotland, he was a sort of revelation because he'd never played up here. You know, he'd gone straight from Lossie down to Bury, so nobody really knew him. So when he came up for the World Cup trials, it was, you know, he was a find, he was a discovery. I'm thinking, man's playing for Nottingham Forest in the first division. What are you talking about? He's not just walked in off the street, but there was a real feeling that because he wasn't, you know, because even most of the Anglo players, you know, had made their names up here and then gone south, you know. But he was one of those who'd gone south and never really played a competitive game up here until he played for Scotland.
You mentioned the World Cup. Tell us about.
Well, the world. I mean, the Scotland's long, sad history in the World Cup. You know, it is no surprise when you look at how poorly historically it's organised. I mean, as I researched the '58 World Cup, I was just absolutely. I mean, it's funny, all these events are in the past and there's nothing you can do about them. But as you're reading about them, your blood's boiling. You know, you want to wring somebody's neck, you know. It's funny how the narrative grips you, even though it's, you know, it's the best part of half a century ago. But the Scottish international team was selected and run by committee. So it was the men in blazers doing themselves and each other favours and, you know, picking each other's players and... I mean, there was supposedly an unofficial quota of players who were playing south of the border. You know, if you had 4 or 5, it was close to being a scandal because you know you weren't picking enough players from Rangers and Celtic. So they were one of the last international committees to join the 20th century and actually appoint a manager, which was Matt Busby. And sadly, they appointed him about 3 weeks before the Munich air disaster. And when it was clear that he wasn't going to be able to lead the team into the World Cup, the Scottish FA called an emergency meeting, not to decide who to replace him or how to restructure the party or anything to do with, you know, they called an emergency meeting to discuss travelling to Sweden by boat instead of flying. Because, you know, obviously people were scared of flying after. And so, for the '58 World Cup, Scotland were the most senior person on the coaching side was Dawson Walker, who was a physio. He was a trainer. He was the bloke who ran on with the sponge. And the senior players had to organise the training. The committee men had no idea what was going on. They would produce team sheets and the players would have to say to them, well he's injured. And he's injured. So a couple of times in the World Cup they announced teams and then had to re-announce the team, you know, on the morning of the match because they picked players who weren't fit. And worse than that was just how stingy they were. They were going to Sweden, one of the most expensive countries in Europe, and the players were given no out-of-pocket expenses. they're representing their country abroad. They were told if they wanted Swedish krona, it would be advanced to them while they were out there, and then it would be deducted from their match fees when they got back to this country. So I can't remember what the appearance fee was now, but you got so much if you played for your country, and you got so much if you were a sub, and if you were just in the party and you didn't play, you got nothing. So there were players who went out there. They came home. They owed the Scottish FA money for the honour of having gone to represent their country. And what was worse, and the one thing, my dad never really, as I say, shouted about his career or looked for any recognition. But as you'll know if you've read the book, the one thing that really bugged him towards the end of his life was that he'd never been given a cap, because the Scottish, you probably all know the story. The Scottish FA thought that only games against the other home countries were worth a cap. So you could go and represent your country at the highest level, you could go and play in a World Cup, but because you'd never played against Ireland, Wales or England, that was you. You'd never got a cap. And it only really started to play on his mind, I think, when he sort of reached retirement age, when you start, I suppose, to think about your legacy, and he had a grandson, 2 years old, starting to kick a ball about in the back garden. He's thinking, well, what can I hand down to Joe from a football career? And he had a go, and the Scottish FA knocked in. Could kneel on the floodgates, and if we give one to you, we'll have to. And anyway, he sort of gave up, and then when he realised he had terminal cancer, he had another go, and still got nowhere. And it's one of my regrets that I didn't get stuck in at the time, really, because he had it in his mind that if he could get Ian St John, who wrote does he still write a column in the Sunday Post?
Yeah, it's the same column.
Well, every week. He had it in his mind that if he could speak to St John, he'd get the publicity, and we'd all be fine. Well, St John never called him back, and I said, Dad, look, this is my, I'm a journalist, I can't do much, but one of the things I can do is, I can get you some publicity if you want it. But although he wanted the cap, he didn't want to be seen to be disrespectful to the Scottish FA. He didn't want a public row. And to be honest, myself, I could see, once the papers get it and it becomes, they put people at loggerheads and blow it out of proportion. So I could imagine him, getting all worked up about it when he saw how it blown out of control. So I didn't do anything then, and I sort of wish I had now, because it's only since the book. Probably not. Probably not, but
He has been more of it now.
yeah, retrospectively, I mean, it's funny, I was telling Donnie this beforehand, because when the book came out, I thought, all right, it's not the greatest story in the world, but it's a nice little story for the Scottish papers, the Scottish radio. So I did a little press release, and Random House put it out. Got nowhere. Nobody bid, no interest. And I thought, it's a decent story. I couldn't quite understand why. So when I won the William Hill, I thought, I can either go up there fully composed and say thank you very much and, take my prize and go, or I can use it as a platform to have a go at the Scottish FA. But I thought, if I do that, I'll burst into tears. I thought, if I get up there and start talking about my dad and his cap, I'll get all choked up. So I thought, well, you can either keep your composure and then admit the story's gone, or you can get up there and make a big Jessie of yourself and, hopefully reignite the story. So I got up there, and my voice was cracking, I was just giving it to the Scottish FA. And it worked, because 4 or 5 reporters afterwards were clustered round, and the Scotsman picked it up, and the Edinburgh Evening News picked it up. And they did a great job, because when I was researching the book, and I realised my dad didn't have a cap, and I knew Eddie Turnbull didn't have a cap, because I went through the rest of the Scotland squad from that year's World Cup to see who didn't have a cap, and there were a couple of them. But Eddie Turnbull was the only one still alive. But I thought, I wonder how many others there are. And I thought, oh God, I can't get into that. I can't research that. I'll never finish the book, if I get on to trying to track down every last man who's ever played for Scotland. Because it went on into the 70s, this thing of not giving a cap, except for home internationals. So that's what the Scotsman and the Edinburgh Evening News did, and they did a brilliant job of doing all the footwork, and they came up with this list of 84, and they mounted a campaign, and I encouraged them to focus on Eddie Turnbull, because I thought, you know, no disrespect to my dad, but Eddie Turnbull's a living legend. You know, he's a name that people can really rally round and think, what, Eddie Turnbull sitting in his front room in Edinburgh with no cap? That's a disgrace, you know. And so, you know, they really got a good campaign going. And
there have been the curious incident of Bob Wilson's non-cap.
there had, yeah, which you know, there've been.
Bob Wilson was a player who played in goals for Scotland and was very strong English accent.
Yeah. Although both his parents, I mean, it was.
Yeah.
I think it was just an army posting.
Yeah.
It was an army posting. That's why that was the accident of his birth. You know. So full Scottish family. I've no nothing against Bob Wilson.
Bob Wilson played for Scotland a long time after.
Long time after your dad, and he'd lobbied through Craig Brown and the man who's the chief executive at the time, whose name escapes me for the moment, I think had issued a cap on the quiet. And so when I went back to the Scottish FA, they denied all knowledge of it. They essentially said no cap had ever been issued to Bob Wilson. And I said, well, you know, it's in his living room, what are you talking about? You know, in what parallel universe does Bob Wilson's cap cease to exist because you can't find the paperwork to support it? You know, it's there and he's got it. But they just, you know, blanked it. So that was my first point of attack, because I thought I can get them on a technicality. Because they'd always said to me, if we gave one to your dad, we'd have to give one to everyone. Yeah. So I said, well, right, well, by that logic, you've given one to Bob Wilson, you've got to give one to everyone. But, you know, that got, you know, you quickly understand that the truth doesn't particularly matter. You know, it's only publicity. And really, that's why I'm grateful to the Scotsman, the Edinburgh Evening News, because if they hadn't kept nagging away at it and got the campaign going and got different people behind it, then, you know, it was only the sheer embarrassment of it that the Scottish FA sort of thought, you know, we haven't got a leg to stand on here, we just look like a bunch of misers. How much is 84 caps going to cost us? And
in the end, the magnificent presentation.
Well, it was funny. It was the whole thing was strange. I was in America. I'd just done the Super Bowl, and I was on holiday in Miami, having stayed out in America, and the phone went about 3 in the morning, and immediately, you know, the phone goes in the middle of the night. You think someone's dead. And you think, oh my God, struggling around, and it was another man whose name escapes me for the moment, the current chief executive of the Scottish FA, telling me that, you know, they were finally going to issue the cap, and I was cock a hoop, and I did a couple of interviews and spoke to the Scotsman and a couple of people. And he mentioned perhaps doing something at an international, or I wasn't quite sure what they were going to do. My mum kept saying to me, well, you know, do you think there'll be a ceremony? When I said, I don't know, Mum, I'm sure we'll find out eventually. And I got up one morning and there it was on the doormat in a jiffy bag. Not even recorded delivery. All scrunched, it had just been pushed through the door in a jiffy. It was in a bit of a plastic sort of case, but it was all squashed to pieces. And I thought, if you're going to put it in the post, at least put it in the post to my mother. Don't send it to me, you know. Yeah. So, you know, even when they do right, they can't do it properly. You know?
What did your mother think?
Well, I mean, she was overjoyed to have it. Although I think she was bitter that he wasn't around to see it.
Yes.
And I think the way it arrived, you know, sort of took the edge off it. But I mean, she's cock-a-hoop to have it now. She's got it in a proper display. Next to the one, I should say that for those of you who haven't read the book, although my dad never got a cap in his lifetime, he did get a replica cap made because
$7.99 in autographs.
Autograph extra. No, I'm just conscious of going over ground that some people said, I've read this in the book. Radio Nottingham did do a little piece on it, and there were a couple who owned a trophy business in Nottingham. And the bloke who ran it was a husband and wife team, and he'd grown up watching my father. You know, he'd watched the FA Cup when he was 12 or 14, and so they, out of the goodness of their hearts, researched it all. You know, what a cap of the era would look like, and they reproduced the design as faithfully as they could, and made it and sent it off to him. Which was, you know, he was absolutely over the moon, and I was sort of slightly cynical about it. Well, it's, you know, but it's a fake dad. But, you know, in the end, you know, what's worth more? A cap made out of real affection by some people who watched him play and admired him, rather than something, squeezed out of a reluctant FA because, they realise that they're on a hiding to nothing on PR terms.
Out of embarrassment.
Yeah. So, if he was still alive, maybe. I mean, I'm sure he, he'd be proud to have the official one, but he wouldn't deny the value of the other one.
Later on, of course, we're starting to eat into time now. Later on, your dad was a coach.
Which was a fantastic world for us growing up.
Yeah.
I mean, even as kids, we realised we were privileged. We sort of had the run of Goodison Park, and ran around the dressing rooms after the games, picking up souvenirs, and hanging out at the training ground. So it was.
What kind of coach was he?
He was. I spoke to quite a few of his ex-players, and I thought he's going to be a harsh authoritarian, and there was some of that. But no, they all said he was such an enthusiast, and you expect. Maybe it wouldn't be as effective now because, players are earning so much money and you expect them to be so blasé. That my dad's kind of old-fashioned enthusiasm, you think a couple of them might sort of snicker at it behind their hands. And I thought maybe a few of the players in the 70s did because they were already earning pretty decent money. But no, all the ones I spoke to said he was, he made training interesting. There was always something. There was a different routine, but he was meticulous, just like. May showed me when I came up. My grandfather kept, all the details of every car he'd ever owned, and the purchase price and the sale price, and he had little tables with the rising cost of petrol through the years. And my dad's training books are exactly the same. If any of Everton's players want to know, their distance for the 12-minute run in 1973, my dad's got it all there in his training books. He recorded everything, and he was still a stickler. And then the anecdote that really illustrates just what he was a stickler to the point where he would, bite off his nose to spite his face.
Because standard Scottish.
Well, and never demonstrated more than when. My mum was sick of moving. By the time we got to Everton, the poor woman, she had 7 homes in 9 years, and we got to Everton, and so his next couple of jobs at Blackpool and Bury, he used to commute, and in fact, he lost his job at Blackpool because we refused to move to Blackpool. But the one job we would all have moved for was back to Nottingham, where he'd had his glory days, and so the job came up, and Brian Clough called, and my dad went down, and my dad's an absolute stickler for punctuality. And he sat in Cloughie's office, jingling his change the way he did when he got handed to him. Full going like this. And thinking, and eventually said to Cloughie's secretary, well, where is he? And she made the mistake of telling the truth, which was that he was playing squash. So that was it. My dad just got in his car and came home. And Cloughie called him up the next day and offered him the job, and my dad told him to stuff it. And, and as kids we were like,
Clough's misfortune now, of course, is to be remembered more for brown envelopes. And,
brown envelopes and drink, which is a
brown
pity.
Envelopes, no? You never?
No, I think that,
You're not handing out any
No. What was you? Did you negotiate a fee for it?
I pay no overdue fines yet.
No, my dad was, my dad was such a straight arrow. If ever that was going on, it was going on, over his head or behind his back.
But when you said enthusiasm, is that not just how you picture Stewartie? Always full of...
Yeah. And I admired that in him because long after I'd sort of given up on the game, he was still... he hated all the blather and the hype and all the rest of it. But when that came on, he'd switch over to the golf. He was he had his Sunday afternoon sorted out. He'd be away in between the golf and the football, and skipping the commercial breaks and skipping all the punditry and the talk, which he couldn't stand. But he remained enthusiastic. Long after I was sort of saying, "Damn, but it's just a circus. How can you be bothered?"
Must have been difficult.
But he just saw through it and he just loved the game and loved to see it being played, no matter who it was being played by, even if it was people earning 100,000 times more than he ever earned.
I think if he hadn't signed for Bury, he'd still have been playing football when he came back here. Because that's what he was like. And we could still picture him playing across the golf course.
Which is probably, he'd be as happy to be remembered, for playing there as playing anywhere else, I think, because,
We had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure, you can play in World Cups and you can play in FA Cup finals, but I'm not, I'm not sure there's ever anything as intense as, the games you played when you were a kid, So the games he played as a kid and for St James's, they're.
I played against him, incidentally. I didn't play for St James's.
No,
Maybe I wasn't good enough.
No, if Joe Gamble was here, he'd...
How about some questions? Victor, I've never had you quiet for so long. Nobody was in the same class.
Jerseys and stuff.
Yeah, well, jerseys were another thing. They were even worse with jerseys, the Scottish FA. You weren't allowed a jersey at all. It was stealing. They'd do you for it. Jimmy Murray of Hearts told me this story. They played against England, I think, at Wembley. No, it might have been Hampden. And they'd been hammered, I think, 4-0.
In front of 120.
Yeah. And anyway, he swapped shirts with the England wing half, Bill Slater. And he came in and Dawson Walker says, "Where's your shirt?" He says, "Oh, well, I've swapped it with Slater." He said, "Oh, well, you better go and get it back." So this poor Jimmy Murray, he's just been hammered by England, humiliated, and he has to walk back into the England dressing room. Say, "I'm awfully sorry, can I have..." So if you wanted a shirt, you had to nick one and hope you got away with it. And we'd always thought that we got one shirt in the attic, and it's it's the classic blue V-neck, white, blue with white trim and the badge, beautiful. And I'd always, we'd always grown up thinking that's my dad's World Cup shirt. But it's not, because when I looked at the tape, and it's terrible old grainy Pathé footage of Scotland's game from '58. When I looked at the tape, you can just make out, even then they wore the squad numbers at the World Cup, and he's wearing 21. So it must have been, it must have been from I think it was a friendly against Poland, before they left for the World Cup, and the squad numbers came in, and he could still stuff it in his bag and get away with it. But no, I mean, so we've got that. We've got his cup final kit. A Scotland one or a?
Scotland one. It was in a glass case.
Well, you should make sure nobody's made off with it.
As well. But the pavilion was stuck to
Uh-huh. But is it? And it's what? It's not.
Anyway.
Right. It's not there now then.
Well, that's it. Well, the pavilion was knocked down and rebuilt.
Right.
But I don't know what happened to the nursery.
Which was the SFA team with that all shirts?
Well, I suppose they washed them and reused them. I don't suppose they had that many kits, but. And I think some of them early on. I think it was your responsibility to bring the right socks. I think as well.
Well, it might be my poor niche.
And to play in front of 120,000 folk who were paying whatever.
But we've got scrapbooks, and people have sent me scrapbooks. It's touching, but I sort of feel I wish they'd held onto them themselves. But when people have written me letters about the book, and they've cut pages out of the scrapbooks they had when they were 12, and pictures of my dad. And
What was the most surprising thing you learned then in the process of it?
Surprising thing I learned? Well, I suppose the tightness of the Scottish FA, and I didn't really discover. Well, no, maybe that wasn't maybe I was being a bit naive there, but just the sheer extent of it. No, but stories like the teeth, things like that. I didn't really discover anything about my dad that I didn't suspect. He just sort of became more concentrated in my mind. I sort of confirmed things about him, like you say, his determination to pursue football where other people might just play at it, and to magic himself into a footballer, to will himself into a footballer, with a kind of passion that
Is that
I mean, he might have handed on a few things down, but I don't think he handed on that level of determination. I didn't quite have that.
Yeah. Is that missing today?
Well, it's certainly, I'm not sure it's missing, but it's easy, it's a lot easier to be distracted, isn't it?
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to be distracted. I mean,
I thought
May's grandchildren came round tonight, and they're right. They're straight into the videos because they want their favourite video on.
But as we went out, and we used to
Stole
play
something.
football by lamplight. After the war.
Yeah.
We played up to school because there was a light behind the goals.
Yeah. So no, I mean, there's something to be said for a limited palette of choice. I think probably some kids would welcome a limited palette of choice because I'm sure there are kids growing up feeling absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of choice that is out there.
Well, I was thinking it the other day when during the school holidays, and a bunch of kids passed me and they were going to play golf, and they obviously enjoy playing golf, but we don't produce brilliant golfers. We've had some good golfers, but we've seen somewhere along the line they lose heart or discover girls or something. So blame the woman or drink. Any other questions before Stephen forces drink on us?
Yeah. No, funnily enough, he was teetotal when he played. I think for most of his career he was teetotal, except, and it turns my stomach to think of it, his pre-match ritual was 2 eggs cracked into a glass of sherry.
See that?
For stamina, supposedly. I mean,
See that because probably that's the reason why he's dedicated.
Yeah.
I can see my lifetime.
Yeah.
Very good left wingers like Lossie. One is dead. The other one would be the speedy young father. He wouldn't have been playing hell. He'd been far above your father. That's George Miller.
Right.
And there's Dawson.
Yeah.
And see that's the difference between young people today. For lack of dedication, even if it's golf, they haven't the dedication.
Despite the rewards.
Massive
rewards.
There, Bootsy left against Ian Hector. Speed. He didn't go round Ian Hector, he lived to his legs. But the dearest I thinking back, the dearest I think of football in the day's time is Neil McCann.
Yeah.
Hearts. And he had the same style.
Right.
Just the head dude.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean,
It's great to hear people who did see him play, because that's one of the things. That's one of the regrets I had. I never really did see him play. I was too young. So I mean, I sort of played the odd charity match. When his knee used to lock and he had to
come back, he would play Elvis City.
Yes.
It's interesting you mentioned Hearts there, because I mean there's a case study which might not tie with what you're saying. The fans care.
Yeah.
And the fans are being sold short.
Yeah. Oh no, I think the fans care everywhere, but it's just on the one hand, it's a complete imbalance, isn't it? Because on the one hand, it's an emotional relationship. From the fan side, it's an emotional relationship. From the club side, it's a business relationship.
Right.
And so it's like going to the pantomime. You've got to suspend disbelief in order to be a fan, because you have to persuade ourselves that, it's us against the world, we love the club and the club loves us. Well, the club clearly doesn't love you, the club couldn't care less.
Come to Grant Park.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but the fans do care. It's just, it was easier. I mean, the chairman probably never cared about the fans, but when he was a fat local butcher or car dealer, it was it was all on a much smaller scale, and at least you could identify with the players. But now there's almost no one you can identify with. The complete imbalance in the relationship is there for all to see. But no, the fans do care. They're just not getting a good. They're treated as customers. If you keep treating them as customers for long enough, they'll start turning on you and acting like customers and saying, as some of them do. You see England fans really, turning on the manager or turning on the players after a pretty short space of time, because they're saying, if you don't perform, we paid this much, we reserve the right to heckle.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the price we used to pay to get into Stewartie represented in terms of week's wages. Is there any memory of, nowadays you're paying, Well, I paid 65 quid to watch Scotland play rugby, so
Yeah.
for the last time ever. They lost. I don't know what it costs to get into watch Manchester United, Arsenal.
No, I don't know these days, but it
Spotify is it?
Manchester United were the cheapest clubs in the world.
Manchester the cheap.
Chelsea, the London clubs are preferred the most expensive.
yeah.
Chelsea's 45 quid to back the goals away from home.
Well,
Well, that's
you
not
talk
really-
about the rugby. I have a friend who's an Arsenal season ticket holder, and he was there last Saturday or the Saturday before. And of course, you know, they've got televisions now in the concourse at the new stadium by all the concession stands, so when you're getting your drink, you can. And he said, second half, there were people spending 20 minutes, half an hour in there watching the rugby on the television. So, and he's like, hang on, you've paid to come to a live sporting event for a team you support, and you stood inside by the pie stand watching the rugby on the television. He couldn't get over it.
Your present career is away from football. Yeah.
And well, I think it's, you know, no choice for it to be away from football, having written that book, because that's like my, you know, that's my resignation letter from football, you know.
How do you manage to raise interest in these other sports?
Well, there's enough die-hard anoraks about to just about keep me going, but yeah, it's a pity when Channel 4 was in its heyday. You know, it would, and it wasn't quite so market-driven. You know, it could say, right, we're gonna show American sports, and we're going to show the basketball, and we're going to show the American football, and we're going to show the baseball, and we're going to, you know, it's all part of the American experience. So, you know, that allowed us to go and cover American football and do it quite well. I shouldn't say this because I'm working for ITV on the playoffs and the Super Bowl, but you know, it's been picked up. I was out of it for a few years. It's been picked up now by ITV, who just show the last bit of the season and the Super Bowl, and it's not done particularly well, unfortunately. But I mean, there's a you know, there's always a strong fan base for the cycling. You know, even with all the drugs problems that it's had. Yeah, and it should be. I mean, they keep bumping it onto most of the sport on ITV that isn't Champions League now is on ITV4. But I think the start of the tour this year, because it's in London, yeah, it's starting in London, and it'll be going Pall Mall, it'll be doing, you know, all the sites, it'll be going through the Royal Parks, past Buckingham Palace. I mean, the opening should be fantastic. So that should make it onto ITV1, but then I think the rest of the tour will be, you know, will drift back over onto ITV4, which is a pity, but that's, now that we've got a multi-channel system, you know, unless you've got big pulling power, you're just not going to get on. Which is a pity, because when Channel, you know, when there weren't that many choices and Channel 4 used to show the cycling, it used to catch all kinds of passing people who weren't interested in cycling because the beauty of France and the scenery it was going through. So you pick up people along the way who are interested. They might not know, they might not be able to understand the tactics of this bizarre, massive cyclist going along, and you can't tell one from the other or who's in the lead. You know, and it can be incredibly confusing cycling if you don't know the tactics. But the whole spectacle and the drama and the crashes and, you know, and the sheer beauty of the travel around France was enough to, you know, to pull people in every year.
And what sport would you like to do next?
That's a good question. I think I'd like to move outside sport and do a book outside sport. Much to the disgust of my publisher, who keeps drumming his fingers and saying, "When's the next one?" And I've been called into the headmaster's study next week to give an account of myself and supposedly say what the next book's going to be. But I'd like to break out, I think.
When I went to Canada recently, I passed through Gatwick, and there, sitting in the front of W.H. Smith's in Gatwick Airport, was a big pile of my father. So I emailed Gary to tell him this. There was about 3-4 dozen of them piled up there when I went, and there was 3 left when I came back. So I emailed to ask where he kept his money, and how much there was of it.
No, it's funny. You might know this, Steve, but it's like supposedly it's the Holy Grail in publishing. They wait every summer, and the white smoke goes up over Waterstones, and they announce who's in the 3 for 2s. Because if you're in the 3 for 2s, you're going to sell some books. If you're not in the 3 for 2s, you're shoved at the back and nobody can find you. So we made it into the 3 for 2s, the paperback. So that was.
Even the World Soccer gave you a very big writer.
Did it?
Soccer magazine.
No, somebody emailed me a link. The Socialist Party website reviewed it, and it was funny because all they did was concentrate on the maximum wage and how badly the players were treated, and Billy Meredith making his speech to the TUC about I stand before you as one of the last bonded men in the country, So they took one aspect of the book, fair enough, and just majored on that. So I've been co-opted by the Socialist Party.
So any more questions before we open the wine?
Let's declare the wine open.
Stephen?
Thanks all for coming along, and thank you very much to Gary for coming up here.
Thanks for having us.
For doing a wonderful talk and giving some fascinating.
Thanks to Donnie for not having me stand up here like a lone idiot, delivering a great long speech, half of which I can't remember. It makes all the difference having somebody to. Yeah.
It's all that you're like. Given us a fascinating insight not only into your father, but also into an era of football, which certainly my generation have no idea of what went on compared to the multi-million-pound industry that goes on now, and it really is more of an industry than a sport. Thanks for that. Thank you again, Donnie, for being our talk show host for tonight. It's wonderful.
My pleasure. I think Parkinson's safe.
Drinks on parch.
Wine, tea, coffee, soft drinks as well. We just break that over. Feel free to or if you want to as well.
We'll see how much of that. An all woman front row.
There's no need to ask who you are. No, you look your face.
Really?
Oh my goodness.
I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult.
And Donnie.
The older and thinner in the face I get.